Adventures of Ellen White and the Pioneers. Ellen hears about a dream of a great image.
"Mr. William Miller is going to preach tonight," said Ellen's father one day as he sat down to eat, "and we must go and hear him. I hear that he's preaching a new and strange doctrine. He's preaching that Jesus himself will soon come back to this earth again, and I would like to see if Mr. Miller can prove all of this from the Bible." So that night the Harmon family went to the meeting to hear Mr. Miller in the town of Portland, Maine. Everyone was so interested and quiet as they listened to Mr. Miller read from the Bible about the nearness of the coming of Jesus. Mr. Miller used big, interesting charts to make the Bible prophecies much easier to understand. And he made the Bible so plain and clear that even though Ellen was only 12 years old, she could understand it. We remember also that Jesus was only 12 years old too, when he went to the temple in Jerusalem and talked and discussed with the doctors and the teachers and asked them questions. Mr. Miller preached about a king who had a very unusual dream. The dream was so important that he could not forget about it, and yet at the same time he could not remember the actual dream. The king's name was Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar was the great king of Babylon. His dream was such an unusual dream that it frightened him, but when he woke up, he could not remember what it was, and that bothered him. So he called in his magicians and astrologers, people who study the stars, and his sorcerers, people like witch doctors and fortune tellers, and he told them to tell him what he had dreamed. But it was impossible for these people to tell the king his dream. They said that if the king would tell them what he had dreamed, then they could tell him the meaning of the dream. The king became very angry, and he said that if they could not tell him the dream, that he would know they were not wise men at all, but they were false men, and they had been lying to him all these years. The worried men argued about this, but it was a very unusual thing for the king to ask, because no one could do such a thing. Only the gods could tell such a thing as the king's forgotten dream. For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and he commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. This was bad news. This would also mean trouble for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they too were considered to be wise men. But they had not heard anything about the king's dream or his new law to kill all the wise men. Daniel was very surprised when the king's guard came to get him to be killed with the other wise men. But God and the angels were watching over Daniel, because you will notice that it was not just a plain guard who came to get Daniel, it was the king's captain himself. "Why is the law so hasty for the king?" Daniel asked Arioch, the captain of the king's guards. Then Captain Arioch explained to Daniel all about the forgotten dream and how the other wise men had failed to tell the dream to the king. Daniel realized that this was very serious, and here he was about to be killed because of the other wise men. He did not have any time to lose, so he hurried to the king himself and asked the king to please give him some time, because he was sure that God would help him to be able to tell the king his dream and also what it meant. So the king agreed to wait. This showed that the king must have had faith in Daniel, or he would not have given him more time. The next thing Daniel did was to go quickly and find his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and tell them the latest news, that they could all be killed if God did not help them. I'm sure those 4 young men all knelt very reverently and sincerely in that important little prayer meeting they had, as they asked God to reveal this great secret to them about King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And God did. He knew that Daniel would point the king to the true God, and he showed the dream to Daniel in a night vision. Daniel thanked God and praised him for showing him the dream and what it meant. Daniel was now ready to go in and tell the king the dream and also its important meaning. As Daniel stood before the king anxiously asked, "Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof?" And Daniel answered, "There is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and make known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the last days." Then Daniel started to tell the king just what he had been thinking about even before he had the dream. "O king, as you were lying upon your bed that night, you were thinking and wondering what was going to happen in the future. So God, the only one who can reveal secrets about the future, made known to you just what was going to happen." Daniel 2 says, "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. The image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hand, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. Thou art this head of gold." Yes, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was represented by this head of gold. He had thought Babylon would rule forever, but we see this was not to be when we read the next verse. "And after thee shall arise another kingdom, inferior to thee." It's true that silver is inferior to gold. And when we study history, we find that Medo-Persia took over Babylon, even though it was not as great or as powerful as Babylon. "And another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth." And history tells us that the kingdom was Grecia. "And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron." And history tells us this kingdom was Rome. "And whereas thou sawest the feet and the toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided." The 10 toes represented 10 different kingdoms or nations down in our time right now. Let's go back to verses 34 and 35 and read again just what's going to happen. Look carefully. "Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth." That stone represents the coming Jesus, when he comes back to this earth again to take all the righteous people to his heavenly kingdom. Verse 44 says, "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and it shall stand forever." And that was the wonderful news that Mr. Miller was preaching from Daniel 2. How happy Ellen and her family were to know that Jesus was coming soon. We must ask Jesus to help us to be more like him every day. His power can change our lives so that we will be ready when Jesus sets up this everlasting kingdom. come and join us next time to hear about the night that the moon was as red as blood.